"I'm going to touch you everywhere," Mountain Man told his terrified fat bride what he actually did. "Take her, if you still want her," the man sneered, tossing his cigar into the mud. "No one else would. She's too big for any real man." The crowd outside the tiny Colorado church burst into laughter. Penelope, Penny Harrison, stood frozen at the foot of the steps, cheeks burning beneath her lace veil. Her wedding dress, too tight, too white, clung to her trembling frame like a cruel joke. Her father's hand gripped her arm hard enough to bruise. "You'll marry him, Penny," he hissed. "He's the only man willing to save this family. You will not humiliate me today." The church door opened, and Garrett Blackwood stepped out. He was taller than any man she'd ever seen, broad-shouldered, weather-scarred, his eyes a piercing glacier blue. A hush rippled through the crowd. He didn't smile, didn't bow. He simply said, "Let's go." Penny's stomach twisted. She wanted to run, but her mother's tear-streaked face stopped her. So she followed the stranger who had just bought her freedom and her future in one cold exchange. Hours later, the wagon rattled up a lonely trail into the wilderness. Pines closed around them like walls, the air thick with silence. Penny clasped her hands, whispering a prayer. She could feel his eyes on her, measuring, unreadable. When they reached the cabin at dusk, the sky bleeding orange behind the peaks, Garrett dismounted and said in that deep, deliberate voice, "Get inside. We'll talk later." But later came sooner than she expected. He shut the door, faced her across the firelight, and said words that froze the blood in her veins. "Penny, I'm going to touch you everywhere." The fire crackled, the mountain wind howled outside, and her heartbeat drowned out everything else. For a long moment, Penny could only stare at him, her pulse hammering against the silk of her throat. The flames flickered across Garrett Blackwood's face, casting sharp lines across his jaw, the faint scar that traced down his cheek like a secret the world had tried to erase. His words echoed in her mind. "I'm going to touch you everywhere." She stumbled back, clutching the torn hem of her wedding gown. "Please, don't," she whispered. Her voice cracked like dry wood. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't hurt me." Garrett's brow furrowed. For a man known across the mountains for his composure, her terror unsettled him. Then, as realization dawned, his expression softened. "Penny," he said quietly, his tone stripped of command, "that's not what I meant." He took one step forward, slow enough for her to see his hands, large, scarred, empty, lift in a gesture of peace. "You've been shaking since the moment you stepped off that wagon. You're pale, and you haven't eaten since dawn. You've been out in the cold for hours." Her lips parted, confusion replacing fear. He nodded toward the hearth. "You've got scratches on your arms, dirt on your cheek, and you're limping. I meant I'm going to check you to make sure you're not hurt." His voice dropped to something almost tender. "I'd never lay a hand on a woman without her permission, not even my wife." The word wife felt strange on her tongue, but less like a chain when he said it. Garrett moved past her, keeping his distance, and grabbed a folded wool blanket from a cedar chest. "Sit," he said gently. When she didn't move, he added, "Please." Penny sat. He knelt in front of her, not towering over her, not claiming her, but steady and careful, as he reached for a bowl of warm water. He dipped a cloth into it and began to wipe the dirt and pine needles from her hands, never once looking higher than her wrists. "Why?" she asked finally, voice small. He paused. Because someone should have cared for you long before I did. That night, Garrett cooked stew while she sat in silence, still trembling. The cabin was sparse but strong. Hewn timber walls, a bearskin rug, shelves of herbs and bandages. It was a healer's home, not a hermit's. When she asked about it, he only said, "Old habits. I used to be a doctor once." Penny studied him over the rim of her bowl. The firelight caught the sadness buried deep in his eyes, and for the first time since she met him, she realized that beneath the stoic calm was a man who'd known loss. Later, as the snow began to fall against the window panes, Garrett pointed to the small bedroom off the main room. "You'll sleep there. The stove keeps it warm." "And you?" she asked. He shrugged. "The chair by the fire will do." Before blowing out the lantern, he added, "You're safe here, Penny. I promise you that." As she lay in bed that night, wrapped in the thick wool blanket he'd left for her, she listened to the soft rhythm of his breathing from the next room. The fear that had once been a storm inside her chest began, at last, to quiet. But deep down, she couldn't help but wonder, who was the man who had chosen to live alone on a mountain, and why did he look at her like she was something fragile worth saving? Morning came softly over the mountains, painting the snowdrifts outside Garrett's cabin in gold. Penny awoke to the smell of coffee and the sound of boots moving across the wooden floor. For a brief, heart-stopping second, she forgot where she was. Then the events of the previous day returned. Her father's betrayal, the hurried wedding, the long climb into wilderness, and the man who had promised not to hurt her. She sat up. Her wedding dress hung over a chair, still damp from melted snow. A clean wool skirt and blouse were folded neatly beside it, along with a note written in a surprisingly elegant hand. "Breakfast is on the stove. I'll be back after checking the traps. Don't go outside without boots." Gee. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, but inside, the cabin was warm and steady. Penny wrapped herself in a shawl and looked around properly for the first time. Everything was built with purpose. Sturdy shelves, tools polished from use, stacks of chopped wood by the door. It wasn't a rich man's home, but it was one carved from discipline and care. When Garrett returned, snow crusted on his shoulders, she was stirring the pot on the stove. "You're awake," he said simply, hanging his coat by the fire. I found the food," she replied. "I hope you don't mind." He shook his head. "You're my wife. Eat whenever you need to." The word wife made her cheeks warm again. It sounded strange, but not cruel, the way he said it, more like a fact than a claim. They ate together in quiet. Penny noticed how he watched the world more than he spoke, his eyes always scanning. Through the window, toward the tree line, like he carried an invisible weight. She wanted to ask, but didn't. After breakfast, he hitched the mule and told her, "I'm going to show you the trail. You need to know where the spring and the smokehouse are in case I'm gone." Penny followed him into the cold. The forest stretched endlessly, the sky a wide gray bowl. She struggled to keep pace, breath puffing white. Garrett slowed without comment, shortening his stride until she could walk beside him. "This is the creek," he said, pointing to a ribbon of water half frozen under a thin crust of ice. "You can fill buckets here, but stay close to the path. Wolves roam lower in winter." Her eyes widened. "Wolves? They won't bother you," he said. "Not if you keep your lantern lit." They spent the day gathering firewood, clearing snow from the roof, and mending fences around the small goat pen. Penny's muscles screamed, but she refused to complain. When she stumbled, Garrett was there instantly, his hand steady at her elbow. That touch, brief, firm, respectful, sent a strange warmth through her chest. It wasn't desire, it was safety. By the time they returned, dusk had painted the mountains violet. Garrett helped her inside, shaking snow from his beard. She laughed softly without meaning to, and he looked at her in quiet surprise. "What?" she asked. "First time I've heard you laugh," he said. "It suits you." Her heart fluttered. "I can't remember the last time I had reason to." He nodded slowly, eyes thoughtful. "Maybe we can change that." That night, as the fire crackled, Penny sewed torn seams in her dress while Garrett worked on carving a piece of wood. She realized he wasn't carving tools, he was shaping tiny animals, delicate and precise. "You're an artist," she murmured. "Just a man who's had too many long winters," he replied. But she saw the truth in his eyes. There was gentleness there, buried deep beneath the scars. When she finally went to bed, she heard him murmuring a quiet prayer near the fireplace, a voice roughened by years of solitude asking for grace. Outside, the snow continued to fall, cloaking the cabin in white silence. Inside, two strangers shared the fragile beginnings of trust, born not from passion, but from patience. And for the first time since leaving home, Penny felt the smallest spark of something she hadn't dared to believe in for years: hope. The weeks that followed fell into a quiet rhythm, the kind of life Penny had never known before. Simple, unhurried, but filled with moments that seemed to linger. The snow outside grew thicker, muffling every sound except the crackle of the fire and the soft clinking of spoons in bowls. Each morning, Garrett rose before dawn. Penny would wake to the scent of wood smoke and the faint thud of his axe outside. Through the frosted window, she would see him, bareheaded despite the cold, breath misting in the air, his movement steady and sure as he split logs. Sometimes he'd catch her watching and lift a hand in silent greeting before carrying the wood inside. He always set one log aside for her, smooth, knotless, light enough that she could practice splitting it herself. "Everyone should know how to make their own fire," he said. "It keeps you alive." The first time she swung the axe, it stuck awkwardly halfway through the log. Her arms trembled, her cheeks burned with embarrassment. Garrett said nothing. He just placed his hands over hers, guided the motion, and together they brought the axe down cleanly. The log split with a satisfying crack. "There," he said softly, "you did that." No one had ever spoken to her that way before, not as if she were helpless, but as if she were capable. That simple moment stayed with her longer than any compliment. Inside the cabin, Penny began to leave her mark. She scrubbed the shelves, mended curtains, and replaced rough wool blankets with soft fabric she sewed herself. She even coaxed a few flowers to grow in small clay pots near the window. When Garrett came in one evening, his eyebrows lifted slightly. "It looks different," he said. "Warmer," she corrected with a small smile. He nodded, glancing around. "Feels that way, too." They ate together every night. Garrett wasn't a talkative man, but Penny learned his silences, the way he listened with small nods, the faint curl of a smile when she told him stories from her hometown. She noticed the things he did instead of said, leaving an extra quilt by her bed, sharpening her sewing scissors, fixing the loose hinge on her chest without being asked. One evening, when a storm howled outside, Garrett found her staring into the fire, lost in thought. "Do you miss them?" he asked quietly. "My family?" she said. "Sometimes, but mostly I miss who I thought they were." He said nothing for a long while. Then he murmured, "People show their truth when money or pride's at stake. It's not your fault for seeing the best in them." There was something in his voice that told her he spoke from experience. Later that week, Penny discovered an old sketchbook tucked in one of the drawers. Inside were drawings, precise, graceful, of plants, human anatomy, even medical tools. It was Garrett's handwriting in the margins: ligament, femur, thoracic cavity. "You were a doctor," she said that night, holding up the book. He looked up from mending a harness, eyes distant. "A long time ago." "What happened?" His jaw tightened. "I failed. My wife and our son. Fever took them before I could stop it. I tried to save them, and I couldn't. After that, I couldn't bear to be around patients anymore. Every life I touched just reminded me of the ones I lost." Her heart ached for him. "But you saved me," she said softly. That made him pause. "Maybe that's why you're here," he admitted. "Maybe we were both meant to have another chance." Their eyes met, his filled with old grief, hers with something new and fragile. For the first time, Penny didn't look away. The snow fell thicker as winter deepened. Days blurred into a steady rhythm of work and quiet companionship. Garrett taught her how to track prints in the snow, how to tell time by the sun, how to carve simple shapes from wood. Penny, in turn, taught him how to laugh again, over burned bread, clumsy stitching, and the way his hair stuck up every morning. One night, while repairing a torn quilt, her hand brushed his. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through both of them. Garrett froze. Then, slowly, he turned his palm to hold hers. His thumb traced a light circle on her skin, gentle, uncertain. "You're trembling," he murmured. "So are you," she whispered back. He smiled then, a real one, warm and unguarded. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Outside, the wind screamed through the trees, but inside, the cabin glowed with firelight and something even stronger: trust. Fragile but growing, flickering like the flame that refused to die. For the first time, Penny didn't feel like a burden or a bargain. She felt wanted. Not for what she owed, not for what she looked like, but for the quiet way she fit into his world. And somewhere deep inside her, she knew, whatever lay ahead, she would never again be the frightened girl sold to save a family's name. She was becoming something else, someone loved. Spring came slowly to the mountains, shy and cautious, like a stranger knocking on a locked door. The snow melted into rivulets that sang through the pines, and the valley below filled with mist. For the first time, Penny could open the cabin windows and smell something other than smoke and pine sap, the scent of thawing earth and the faint sweetness of wildflowers. Garrett's mood, however, changed with the season. He worked longer hours, disappeared for half the day into the forest, and when he returned, there was a distance in his eyes that frightened her. At night, when she asked if something was wrong, he would simply shake his head and say, "You don't need to worry about it." But Penny did worry. She had learned by now that Garrett's silences weren't born of indifference. They were walls, built out of guilt and habit, and those walls were rising again. One afternoon, while sweeping near the desk by the window, Penny noticed an envelope tucked beneath a stack of old medical books. It was addressed to Garrett Blackwood, M.D., written in a delicate feminine hand. The wax seal was broken. Against her better judgment, she opened it, and her breath caught. The letter was from a woman named Eleanor Finch, the widow of a mining foreman in town. It read, "Garrett, the town council has voted to reopen the clinic. We still need a doctor. The people trust you. They always have. I know you said you'd never come back, but this place is dying without your hands. Please reconsider. Yours, Eleanor." Penny folded the letter with trembling fingers. Something inside her chest twisted, not jealousy, but fear. Would he leave her? That night, she waited until he returned from setting traps. He looked exhausted, snow dusting his shoulders, his eyes shadowed by thought. "Someone wrote to you," she said carefully. "From town." He froze mid-step, his face unreadable. "You read it?" I didn't mean to," she stammered. "It was open. It's fine," he interrupted, but his tone was flat. He sat heavily in the chair by the fire, staring into the flames. "Eleanor Finch, she wants me to come back." "To be a doctor again," Penny whispered. He nodded once. "They need one. Half the valley's sick this time of year, and He rubbed a hand across his face. "I could help them." "Then why don't you?" Garrett's jaw clenched. "Because the last time I tried to help someone, they died. My wife, my boy. Do you understand what it's like to hold the people you love most and realize your hands are what killed them?" Penny stepped closer. "You didn't kill them. You did everything you could." His voice hardened. "That doesn't change the fact that they're gone." Silence filled the room, thick and brittle as glass. Finally, Penny said softly, "Maybe that's why you found me, because you needed to learn that healing doesn't just come from medicine. Sometimes it comes from being loved again." He looked up then, really looked at her, and something cracked behind his eyes. "You shouldn't love me, Penny. I'm broken in ways that can't be fixed." She shook her head. "Then let me be the one who doesn't try to fix you, just to stay." Before he could answer, the sound of hooves shattered the stillness outside. Garrett's instincts kicked in. He grabbed his rifle and went to the door. Through the falling dusk, a figure approached on horseback. A tall man in a dark coat with a silver badge glinting at his chest. The sheriff. He dismounted slowly. "Evening, Blackwood," he called. "Sorry to bother you, but I've got a warrant to search the property. There's talk in town that you've been harboring a runaway woman, a married one." Penny's blood ran cold. "No," she whispered. The sheriff's eyes narrowed when he spotted her at the door. "Well, I'll be damned. Mrs. Penelope Harrison. Thought your husband in Denver would be mighty worried about his missing bride." Garrett stepped forward, voice like steel. "She's not his wife anymore. Not by choice, not by law." "That's for a judge to decide," the sheriff replied. Penny's heart pounded as Garrett moved in front of her, shielding her from the man's line of sight. "You're not taking her anywhere," he said. "Garrett," she whispered, gripping his sleeve, "please, don't." He didn't look back. "You said once I was a doctor, but tonight I'm something else." He raised the rifle just enough for the firelight to glint off the barrel. "I'm her husband." The sheriff hesitated, eyes flicking between the weapon and the man holding it. The mountain wind screamed between them, carrying the scent of snow and smoke. And in that moment, Penny realized the man who once promised to touch her everywhere wasn't a monster. He was a shield, and he was ready to fight the whole world to keep her safe. The wind outside howled like a living thing, rattling the shutters and swirling snow through the cracks in the door. The sheriff stood on the porch, boots crunching against the ice, his hand resting near the holster at his hip. Garrett didn't flinch. His rifle remained steady, the firelight reflecting off its steel barrel. "Garrett Blackwood," the sheriff said evenly, "you know threatening an officer of the law can land you in prison. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Garrett's voice was low, calm, but every syllable burned with quiet conviction. "You came up this mountain with lies. You came here to drag her back to a man who bought her like cattle. I won't let you." The sheriff's gaze flicked toward Penny, who stood trembling behind Garrett. "Ma'am, you're coming with me. Your husband's filed charges, says you ran off with this man, took jewelry and cash." Penny's breath caught. "That's not true," she said, her voice cracking. "He locked me away. He hurt me." Garrett took a small step forward, his stance like a wall of granite. "You hurt her? She's not going anywhere." The sheriff's expression softened slightly, as if realizing this wasn't just another case. "Blackwood, you know how this looks, harboring another man's wife." "She's my wife," Garrett cut in sharply. "We married in good faith. I got the papers right here." He tossed a worn envelope onto the porch, its contents stamped and signed by the town clerk. The sheriff glanced at it, jaw tightening. The law was one thing, but the truth written across both their faces was another. Penny stepped forward then, her fear swallowed by something fiercer. "Sheriff," she said, voice trembling but clear, "I didn't steal anything. The only thing I took was my freedom, and I'll die before I give it back." For a moment, no one moved. The snow fell in heavy flakes, hissing as they melted on the cabin's roof. Garrett lowered his rifle, slowly. "You can tell whoever sent you," he said, "that if they want to claim her, they'll have to climb this mountain themselves. But if they do, they won't leave it the same way." The sheriff studied them for a long moment, two figures standing side by side, framed by the flickering light of the hearth. Finally, he sighed, the fight leaving his shoulders. "You two got a hell of a mess down there," he muttered, "but up here, maybe the law don't mean as much as what's right." He turned toward his horse. "I didn't see nothing tonight." When he rode away, disappearing into the snow, Garrett exhaled for the first time in minutes. His hands trembled as he set the rifle aside. Penny turned to him, tears streaming down her face. "You could have been killed," she whispered. He reached for her then, his hands rough but gentle against her cheeks. "You're worth dying for," he said simply. And before fear or reason could stop her, Penny kissed him, desperate, trembling, but certain. It wasn't the kiss of a frightened bride. It was the kiss of a woman who had finally chosen her own fate. When they pulled apart, the fire crackled softly, throwing sparks into the air. Garrett rested his forehead against hers and murmured, "You're safe now, Penny. As long as I'm breathing, you always will be." Outside, the snow kept falling, quiet, endless, forgiving. The storm passed by dawn, leaving behind a silence so pure it felt sacred. The world outside the cabin shimmered under a thin veil of frost, every tree branch glittering like crystal. Inside, the fire had burned low, but its warmth lingered, soft, steady, alive. Penny awoke first. Garrett was still asleep in the chair beside the hearth, his head bowed, the rifle leaning against his knee. Even in rest, he looked like a man guarding something precious. She watched him for a long moment, her heart swelling with gratitude and something deeper, peace. She rose quietly, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and stepped outside. The air was cold enough to sting her lungs, but the view stole her breath more than the chill ever could. Below her, the valley stretched wide and endless, the smoke from the distant town curling upward like a memory she no longer needed. When Garrett joined her, he didn't speak at first. He simply stood beside her, their shoulders brushing. Then he said, in that low, gravelly voice that had once terrified her, "You're not afraid any more." She smiled faintly. "No. You taught me there's a difference between being touched and being held, between being owned and being loved." Garrett's hand found hers. "And what am I to you now?" Penny looked up at him, the man who had once been her captor by circumstance, but had become her shelter by choice. "You're home," she said simply. He kissed her forehead, his breath warm against her skin. "Then I reckon I'll never let this home go cold." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and promise. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled back to life, and two shadows, no longer strangers, moved together in its glow. The mountain had kept its secret. Love, quiet and enduring, had taken root there. Every time I write stories like this, I'm reminded that love doesn't always arrive in the way we expect. Sometimes it begins in fear, in silence, in misunderstanding. But when kindness takes root, it can turn even the coldest mountain cabin into a home. If you're still listening right now, tell me, where in the world are you hearing this story from? Because no matter the distance, stories like this connect us. And if you still believe that true love can heal even the deepest scars, stay close. The next story will be waiting for you soon.